Good morning and welcome to this latest morning scoop from the Arizona Capitol Times. What makes a good election? Our esteemed panel this morning, Sybil Francis, Chair, President, and CEO of the Center for the Future of Arizona, and Bill Gates, the Executive Director of the Mechanics of Democracy Laboratory. I'm Steve Goldstein. Coming up over the next hour or so, we'll dig into some results of a recent CFA poll. We'll also be taking your live questions, so please, in the chat or in the Q&A function, please let us know. We'll try to get to as many as we can, as long as they're relevant to the topic we are discussing. And I want to welcome Sybil Francis to talk about what the Center for the Future of Arizona is, and talk about why today's conversation matters and how it fits in with the work and research that CFA has done over the years. Sybil, please.
Thanks so much, Steve, and it's great to be with you and Bill this morning, and I'm really excited about our topic today. I think elections people feel very passionately about them, and they're so important to our democracy. And so I wanted to take just a minute to share a little bit about Center for the Future of Arizona and how and why we got into doing this particular survey so that you can have some context. But for those of you who don't know Center for the Future of Arizona, we're a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that I'm the co-founder of, and we've been in existence for 23 years since 2002. The mainstay of our work, our guiding light, are public opinion surveys these help inform our own work. And when we discovered all the interesting things that we did through our survey research over the years, we also found it very, very important to share with others, with leaders across the state. So we really are about how do we drive data-driven discussion, decision-making, and action around what matters most to Arizonans. So we're about elevating the voices of Arizonans, centering their voices. Some of you may be familiar with our Gallup survey work. We started our first Gallup survey exercise nearly 20 years ago. We've done two major surveys across many issues of importance to Arizonans: education, immigration, workforce, housing, water, etc. And again, very much focused on where we come together as Arizonans. I think one of the ahas and amazing findings over the years of our work is, despite political polarization, the people of Arizona actually agree on much more than we disagree on the big important issues. And this is one of our missions, is to share that information to help us come together around opportunities for positive change around those issues. So our website, you can find all that information from our Gallup work. In 2022, we also decided that we would start surveying likely voters in election years to find out what's on their minds. Gallup was really foundational. What do Arizonans see for the next 10 or so years for Arizona? The 2022 survey was more around some of the issues that might be on people's minds during elections. Again, not a political survey, but trying to really get at the root of what matters to Arizonans. The Arizona Voters Agenda also is about where we have consensus. For an item to be on the Arizona Voters Agenda, it has to receive 50% agreement among Democrats, 50% among Republicans, and 50% among independent, non-affiliated voters. And I think some of the results might surprise people who haven't studied it, because many times things that we hear in the political atmosphere about what's important to voters actually doesn't show up as such on our survey research. So the way we ask our questions, and we work very much with our partners, is to ask questions in a very neutral fashion and not leading. So we worked with Gallup, we worked with High Ground on our Arizona Voters Agenda, and we were really thrilled to partner with Noble Predictive Analytics on this latest survey. So it's really about getting baseline data. Sometimes we ask obvious questions. You might say, why are we asking such an obvious question? Well, sometimes what you think is the obvious answer doesn't turn out to be that, but it helps us also provide a baseline. And then we also ask about so-called hot button issues, but again, not in a leading way. And we often discover that those are not necessarily the issues on people's minds. So we get very interesting results. This is the first time ever we've done a single issue survey. So I think we understand that this is a very important issue, elections, and it's such an important topic. So we're really pleased to partner with Bill Gates of Model, and he's going to say more about that in a moment. But the question of what does a good election look like, I love to share the story of how this came about. I heard Bill at an event say as part of his remarks, what does a good election look like in the eyes of Arizonans? And I thought that's a question that we want to partner with Bill Gates on. So this is an election year, a really important year. I'm excited about this discussion. We really focused on things like election mechanics, trustworthiness of elections and election administration, election design and processes, and we're going to walk through some of those data points. So it's really very much in line with our elevating the voices of Arizonans on issues of importance to Arizonans and our future. Thanks, Steve.
Sybil, thanks so much. And Bill, for those who know you as a former elected official, you have been with ASU for a little bit. I'm going to say more than a year because I'm just going to hedge on that. But the Mechanics of Democracy Laboratory, please give our viewers an idea of what that is and what you've been accomplishing of late.
Thanks so much, Steve. It's great to join you today and great to join Sybil. I was very fortunate to come over here to ASU at the end of my time on the Board of Supervisors, where I was involved along with my colleagues on leading the administration of elections in Maricopa County, the fourth largest county in the country. Here at Arizona State University, we have established the Mechanics of Democracy Laboratory. And our focus is on providing more visibility to our residents about how elections are run. We are focused on providing support and assistance to our elections officials who have an incredibly hard job and do a wonderful job. Our focus today we're going to be talking about Arizona elections, but given ASU's broad, really now international platform, we are working with elections officials across the country. And probably my favorite part is that we're working with students every day. One of the upshoots of all of the attention that elections administration has gotten over the past few years is now young people know that elections is a job. And that elections don't just magically occur, but they're run by Americans, great people who work hard, who are most often outside of the spotlight. But I have a lot of students who are coming to me who are excited about a potential future career in elections. So we're working with them on research, and they're having opportunities to work in some of our local election offices as we move into this election year. As Sybil mentioned, something that I've been talking about a lot at Model, and frankly, this has been inspired by elections officials such as Scott Jarrett, the elections director of Maricopa County, is what is it that really makes a good election? You know, we have community leaders, we have politicians who have opinions on what it is that Arizonans want out of their elections. So I was thrilled when Sybil suggested that we work together to put together a survey to find out what exactly is it that makes a good election in the opinion of Arizona voters, and then digging deeper into how they feel about elections. Do they trust them? And to the extent that they don't, where is it that they don't have that trust? So again, thanks for the opportunity today and looking forward to the discussion.
Bill, thanks. We will be digging in very deeply on a lot of details, and we'll be dispersing or interspersing some slides here and there, one of which we'll get to in just a moment. But Sybil, before we get to that, which to preview, talk about the principles of a good election, one number really stood out to me as we get this conversation started. 97% of Arizonans believe that fair and secure elections are essential to a healthy democracy. What do you make of a figure that high? 90, we're going to get to some numbers that are in the 90s, but the idea that we're coming from this place of agreement, which is obviously a very important foundation to begin with.
Well, it's really fascinating because, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, we've been doing survey research for almost 20 years now, and this is probably the highest or equal to the highest result we have ever found on any question. So we try not to judge responses because, as I mentioned, we're nonpartisan and we're really trying to listen to Arizonans. But I have to say, I was very encouraged to hear this because it really provides a baseline. You know, we talk a lot about whether people trust elections or how elections are run, but I think this is a good example of how we try to establish a baseline of understanding of where Arizonans are coming from. So this is an issue very important to Arizonans, and they believe that elections are absolutely critical. Safe and fair and secure elections are essential to a healthy democracy. So that's a really great baseline on which to start our other questions, to launch our other questions about the outlook of Arizonans.
Bill, as you mentioned, you had experience working in election administration as a county supervisor. That 97% number has to be pretty encouraging.
Yeah, it's very encouraging, and I think it's encouraging to those folks who are working in elections today. Unfortunately, in my opinion, some elections officials have been unfairly maligned. There have been questions that have been raised about their integrity and their competence. And so, my thought is that when you see those numbers, seeing that an overwhelming majority of Arizonans believe that elections are important, then that I think can definitely give them that oomph to get up every day to go do the hard work that they do, knowing just how important it is to our voters and to our democracy.
All right. Now, as I mentioned, CFA asked about what the core principles of good election are. We have a slide with some of those numbers. Let's get those up and take a closer look. Okay. Can everyone see those numbers, I hope? Bill and Sybil?
Yes, and hopefully the audience can as well.
Yes. All right. So let's start off, Sybil, let me start off with accuracy, which is not only tied for the total importance at 96%, but also the highest when it comes to essential. Every ballot counted and counted correctly.
Yeah, let me just back up and just give a little bit of context. This is another kind of foundational laying set of questions. So are elections, fair and secure elections, essential to democracy? The answer is yes. Then the question is, what are the core principles of a good election? Because this is really the heart of the question that we're trying to answer with this survey. And so it's very important to establish, what are those important principles? We asked if these issues were essential, important, not very important, not important at all, or not sure. So you're seeing the results of that in those two columns. So you can see on overall that the things that we asked about are all considered important. That's the total important column. Essential really gets at what do people believe are really the essential core. So again, you'll see that many of these are important. Some of them do fall below the 50% mark, which is a kind of a cutoff in some of our other survey research about what is considered a consensus item. But you'll see that the top one is accuracy. If elections are essential, fair and secure elections are essential to democracy, then we need an accurate count so that people feel comfortable about that. So I think accuracy is clearly a very, very important principle for voters.
And Bill,
Or
what's your
for
reaction to
Arizonans, I
that?
should
And
say.
I'm asking this question. No one's introducing the politics of it. I am. But when you consider that that is what is the stirs is, wait a second, I'm not convinced that these ballots are counted. How does it feel for you to see that at 96%, that being important?
Yeah, that is, I mean, that's certainly what I would have expected. But what I think what it does show is that being number one is maybe a little inconsistent with some who have pressed other issues other than accuracy, speed. We'll get to that later. But when things are done, accuracy is what matters, and there are certain things that we have to achieve accuracy. That means that we may have to downplay other things such as speed or even convenience. So accuracy is number one. I think everyone who is in elections is not surprised by that finding.
And Sybil, the next one is transparency, that election processes are clear and observable. Similar numbers to accuracy, although essential, slightly lower. How would you define those numbers? How would you look at those?
So I think if we go back to this idea that Arizonans want fair and secure elections, I think part of that is how do they persuade themselves that these are fair and secure? And this is what transparency is all about. How do I know that this election has been conducted in a fair and secure way? So I think that's also very important. So you want to assure yourself as an Arizonan that these processes are clear and observable. So that is part of what a fair and secure election would be.
Was the feeling when you were in office that the election processes were as transparent as they could be, or were best practices sort of implemented after that to make sure let's really double and triple down on transparency?
Yes, beginning with kind of the late 2010s and then, of course, going into the 2020s, we saw much greater interest in the running of elections than we'd ever seen before. And the good news for Arizona voters is that elections officials across the state responded and made the procedures much more transparent. The press conferences that were conducted in Maricopa County and elsewhere across the state. And now, as we have seen new elections facilities being opened in counties such as Pinal County and Coconino County, we're seeing these buildings being designed in a way that it's very easy for the general public to see the entire process. So Arizona voters want transparency, and they're getting it from their elections officials.
Sybil, next on the list is trustworthy. People running elections are objective and impartial.
Yes, people certainly want to feel that there isn't any kind of undue influence on people running elections or tallying up those votes. And so this comes through loud and clear, I think, in these results. And if you again take those top three, it's really about fair and secure elections. These are the building blocks of a fair and secure election.
Bill, what are your thoughts on that one?
Yeah, so this is an interesting finding. In most of the world, you have independent, nonpartisan, non-elected folks who are responsible for running in elections. In the United States, we have a different system. Many of the elections officials, top elections officials, are elected as partisans. And so this is an issue that you're hearing people talk about, raising questions about that system, but that's the system we have. And I can tell you that elections officials across Arizona are very sensitive to that, and they have put measures in place to address it. For example, when I was at Maricopa County, we established a policy that none of the people on the ballot would be allowed into the ballot tabulation room. So things of that sort, to the extent that our elections officials can focus on that, we can see that that's something important to Arizona voters.
And Sybil, our other one that is also in bold. Oh, sorry, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I just saw a question come in from Ken Bennett that is kind of timely. So how do we
Secretary of State, yes.
How do we show, hi Ken, thanks for being here. How do we show citizens that the results can be proven to be accurate? At least my answer to that would be if you have transparency and if you trust elections officials, then that is a big step towards assuring people that elections are accurate. And then I think education about the process, and I think Bill could say a lot more about that, but it seems to me the more people understand about how the system works, how do the voting machines work, how does the mail-in ballot system work, how do all these things work, that can increase confidence. But Bill, you might want to jump in on that too.
Yeah, great to see this question from my friend and our former Secretary of State, Ken Bennett. And that's right. I agree with Sybil's point. We have logic and accuracy tests that demonstrate at the beginning and at the end of the election that the machines are working properly. It is important, I think, when people understand that we have representatives of both the Republican and Democratic Party that are involved in this process throughout. So we have eyeballs on the process. So if there are concerns, we have representatives of the two parties who can raise those concerns with our elections officials who will address them. But I couldn't agree more that the more transparency we have, there's more opportunity to prove the accuracy. And that's why I've always been supportive of audits that are nonpartisan audits that are done by experts. I think that can also help give people confidence in the accuracy of our elections.
Well, I want to ask you one brief follow-up on that. When we do have the observers from the Democratic and Republican parties there, I suppose some of those people may be some who've had some doubts themselves about whether things are accurate or not. How important, on top of what Sybil said about education, how important is it for those folks who are not elected officials, who've actually come in to be the observers to make sure the process is running? Is it important that we hear from more of them publicly to say, you know what, I may have had a question or not, but I've seen the process and I believe in it, as opposed to them sort of saying, oh, that was great, I'll talk to my friend about it. Do they need to be more public about what they've seen?
Yes, without a doubt. To the extent that they're willing to do that, it's very helpful. I certainly appreciate those leaders of both the Democratic and Republican parties over the years who have stood up for the process. Again, if there are issues, if there are problems, those need to be addressed. Those need to be talked about. But when we have elections that are run, that are transparent, that lead to accurate results, I think it's very powerful for those people who are most passionate about these elections to hear from their party leaders that they've been down, they've been to the tabulation centers, they've asked the questions that they wanted to ask, and those questions have been answered to their satisfaction. To the extent that they can go out and particularly speak to their own party members, I think that's vitally important to restoring trust in our elections.
Sybil, I want to go back to our list. Voter access. Voting is equally easy for all eligible voters. It was interesting to see that that is the one we saw a little bit of a drop off as far as the essential percentage was concerned.
Yeah, I think once you start getting into some of the mechanics of voting, you might see some differences. But again, let's look at these numbers. These are incredibly high. 50% is usually what we consider winning an election. 70% we consider a super majority. So, 77% thinking something is essential is it's a little bit in the noise in term. I mean, 64%, I'm sorry. It's a little bit in the noise relative to the differences there.
Bill, any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, this is, voter access is certainly a question that gets raised all the time, and we see that this is very important. I mean, I think Arizonans and Americans in general want to know that everyone has access to the vote. Unfortunately, we have periods in our history where not everyone had access to the vote. So I think that that's part of why you see this being a high number and why there is a focus from all people who care about elections. There's focus by elections officials to making sure that everyone who's eligible to vote and wants to vote has that opportunity to vote.
And as our viewers can see, there is safety of voters and election workers, fiscal responsibility, voter participation. I want to jump to the last one, though, on our list here, Sybil. Speed of results, delivering results quickly. We see 87% total importance, and that is the first one we've seen below 50% at 44% for essential.
Yes, and I hope we'll later share. I think we were planning to share the slide of the exact question and the numbers because I think this one is
Yes.
so important to people, and there's been so much discussion about it that I want to make sure we have full transparency about how we ask the question. But just to comment quickly on here, yes, I think it does kind of stick out in terms of being well below 50% in terms of the determination that speed of results is an essential feature of elections. So we just found that interesting given the conversation going on around this issue. So we just wanted to point that out.
Yeah, and before we get to that slide, which will in a few minutes, Bill, any thoughts about this idea? In some ways, that must be the fact that accuracy is ranked pretty significantly higher, at least on the essential than speed. What are your thoughts on that? As someone who's been involved in election administration, I would think that would be a helpful concept.
Yeah, I think this is a great insight coming from Arizona voters. Here in Arizona, we hear a lot of discussion, especially from candidates and people who are involved in the political process about the speed of our elections. In my opinion, some people have called us the laughing stock of elections in our country because the AP can't call every race on election night. Well, people need to understand, and apparently they do from these results, that the fact that we don't have results announced on election night in every race is not a sign of our weakness, but instead it's a function of a variety of things. Number one, we have close elections. It's well known we're a swing state, and Maricopa County is a swing county. And so the last thing that the media wants to do is get a call wrong, right? To announce one candidate won when it ends up being another person. So I think that the media outlets are very cautious about it. Also, we do have a lot of options as voters in Arizona. We can vote in person on election day. We can vote early by mail. A lot of people do that. And you can also drop off that early ballot on election day. I think it's been well reported by the media that when you do drop off that ballot on election day, which in 2022 and 2024, we had 200,000 voters or more who chose that approach. That slows the processing down and it does slow down the results, but it doesn't mean that the results aren't accurate. So I think this is very interesting. There have been a lot of proposals to put limits on people dropping off those early ballots on election day, or maybe further limitations on early voting. This seems to indicate that speed maybe is not as vitally important to everyone as it is to some people who have a large megaphone around election time.
Well, Bill, thanks to you saying that, I will get to that slide sooner than I was going to. I'll get to that next. I do want to ask Bill one follow-up question on that. And Sybil, if you want to chime in on this, please do. I think, Bill, what you said about the closeness of elections is interesting. I've lived in Arizona for a very long time. And I remember the days when John McCain would win by 30 to 40 points. When Janet Napolitano won re-election for governor, she won by 25 to 30 points. So now that Arizona is more in the spotlight, has that made people wonder how accurate they are, when before they may not have even been, at a national level, may not have even been paying attention to our elections?
Yeah, I mean, there's no question at all about it. There's a lot on the line. And then you add the environment we have now with social media where people are expecting updates minute by minute. They want instant gratification. I think all of these things coming together have created a situation where there's much more of a focus on the administration of election itself in Arizona, as opposed to, the 43 or so states in the US that are blowouts for one side or the other. So it's a function of our politics today. But I personally think as an Arizonan, it allows for a very vibrant democracy and frankly, attention from our national leaders.
Simple thoughts before I go to the next slide, or should I go to the next slide?
Go ahead.
Okay. Okay, so this is what we were discussing, and Bill brought up. Arizonans across politics and age prefer election day ballot drop-off, even if results take longer. So Sybil, describe that for us and how the question was answered.
I wanted to be sure that we showed this slide in full, because when we share this information, because it is such a kind of hot political topic, I will say that it's very important for us to have full transparency about how we ask the question. And then to assess the results. This is not the first time we've asked this kind of question, so it is very consistent with previous questions that we've asked on other surveys. But because we were doing the single issue election, what does a good election look like survey, we wanted to make sure to include this question. So it's very consistent with results that we reported previously, but we did want to ask it again. So this is a common practice in survey research. You can say, which statement do you identify with most closely? So we have voter A and voter B. Voter A wants election results sooner, even if it means limiting convenient voting options. We should stop ballot drop-off a few days before election day to speed up results. I think that's pretty straightforward. Voter B feels it should be easy and convenient for eligible citizens to continue to vote. We should continue allowing voters to drop off early ballots up to and including election day. It's worth it to ensure every voter has a chance to vote, even if it means waiting longer for final election results. This is how we asked the question, and these were the results that we got, which are pretty strongly in favor of continuing essentially the way voting works now, even if it means getting results a little bit later. And what's interesting about it is it's also very consistent with the previous slide that you saw that was asked in a different way. That was a different set of questions where you saw that only 44% of people thought that speed was an essential feature of elections. Even though they would like the results, sure, that would be nice, but they didn't necessarily consider it essential. So I just wanted to make sure we went through this in some detail because of how much it's being discussed.
What are your thoughts on these numbers?
So I really appreciate the way that these questions are asked here, because it sort of raises this point that elections, like many things in politics, involves trade-offs. As the survey shows, all of these principles are supported by Arizonans. They're important and even essential to many Arizonans. But in this one, you really drill down to find out the extent to which Arizonans are willing to make trade-offs. I will say, looking at these numbers, I think that the fact that our system has been set up now for many years, that Arizonans have been able to take that early ballot, that sat on their kitchen table for could be weeks and drop it off on election day, that has sort of become part of our culture. And so I think, people tend to like sort of the way that things are. If the legislature and the governor decide to change things, and just to be clear, this decision is not made by the local elections officials. This is a decision that is made at the statewide level. If the state chooses to change how we run elections and say that people have to drop that early ballot off on, say, the Friday before election day, and that's the cutoff, there will be a massive education effort that needs to take place so that people understand, that the law has changed and that their options have changed. If that doesn't occur, that could lead to long lines on election day and people, frankly, just saying, I'm not going to wait and ending up not voting. But what this shows is that currently people like the options and they like the convenience of the current system, even if it means that it takes a little bit longer for the AP to call a race for one candidate or the other.
Well, Bill, even if this is just food for thought for our viewers, could you give us 30 seconds to a minute on, is there a sweet spot there in your opinion, based on, even if the system is run quite well now, even if what voters want is if we're getting close to that, are there little tweaks you could see that might improve the system, just in your opinion?
So certainly as it relates to the speed of results, there are things that can be done at the local level, even if, the state maintains the same law, but it costs money. And with money, you can bring more people into your election facility. If you have more people in the election facility, you may need a bigger facility to get that work done. So more people, you can also bring in new machines, again, that may be able to tabulate the results faster. All these things cost money. So if Arizonans, and we'll get to that, I don't
Yes,
want
don't give that one away yet. I like that
I don't
one.
want to give that one away. But if people are willing, if Arizona voters are willing to invest more money, there are things that can be done, still having that opportunity to drop off that early ballot on election day, and things that can be done at the local level to speed things up. But in the end, I think what's most important, and I give our local media great credit for this, as well as our local election offices and the Secretary of State's office, of educating people as to why it does take the time it does for the media outlets to call races in Arizona. So I think education continues to be extremely important.
So, Sybil, we'll have one more slide in a moment, but before we get to that, I had one other question for which we don't have a slide, and that is that 81% of Arizonans support the option of early voting by mail. What are your thoughts on that? Arizona has had that system for a couple of decades now, and it seems to have worked well. But what do you make of those numbers?
Well, I really love the way Bill described our voting system as having been embedded in our culture. There certainly was a day when voting by mail was not an option and people were used to the options that they had at that time. It's very clear that Arizonans love their option to vote by mail. And yes, a very, very large number of Arizonans vote that way. I don't have the number off the top of my head. Maybe you do, Bill. I know we looked into that, but I think it's around 80 or more percent. Bill, you can correct me when you take a shot at this question, but it's a very high number, and people really do like that option. I know I've been doing it for the 23 years I've lived here, and a lot of people like the time to be able to really think about what they want to vote on and how to vote. So, I'm stating the obvious, but there have been proposals at the national level and elsewhere to either eliminate voting by mail or make it so that people have to take extra steps in order to do that at every election. So I think our results show that people very much like voting by mail and they'd like to keep it that way.
Bill, go ahead.
Yeah, by the way, Sybil's figures are right. And, this was an interesting thing in 2020. With the pandemic, we had certain states where people were voting by mail, again, being driven by the situation of the pandemic, voting by mail at levels they had never seen before. And it led to controversy, questions, and some confusion, quite frankly, in some states. That was not the case in Arizona. We've been voting by mail since the early 1990s. And in fact, what we've seen historically is that Republicans have voted by mail by very large numbers. And these survey results continue to show that a majority of Republicans are supportive of vote by mail. But now, of course, we see adoption across the political spectrum. So I think that it is very important, as this is something that has been in the news. There have been a lot of suggestions at the national level that vote by mail is flawed. That's certainly not the experience that we have in Arizona. We have many decades of experience doing it. We have signature verification that's done by our county recorders across the state, which has proven to be an effective method of verification. If I might, I see Ken Bennett had a comment on the sweet spot, and I appreciate that Ken has raised this. So Ken is suggesting that the sweet spot for folks who do want to drop off their ballot on election day is that they can actually show up, show their ID, and then open that envelope and have that ballot tabulated on election day, as opposed to having that ballot go into the recorder's office, go through the signature verification. Interestingly, the sweet spot that Ken Bennett has suggested is now the law in 2026. So this is going to be an option. It's not mandatory, but it will be an option. If you want to have your vote tabulated on election night, you can go through that. Now, the one thing I would say to Ken's suggestion that this is the sweet spot, if everyone decided to take that approach, which, by the way, I've talked to local elections officials, they think it'll probably be, maybe 10%, something like that, of voters who will choose that. But let's say everyone chose that approach, it would likely lead to more lines on election day. And we've certainly heard from some candidates in the past few years how upset they are about lines, and in fact, even suggesting that it's some sort of disenfranchisement if you have to wait in a line. I find that kind of laughable, because we all wait in lines for things all the time. But certainly there's a focus by our local elections officials to keep those lines as short as possible. So that would be my one thought on calling that the sweet spot, is that there are always, again, there are trade-offs. And if everyone chooses to do that, I think we will see longer lines on election day. I'm fascinated to see how this new law will work out in practice in the 2026 elections.
Sybil, any thoughts on that?
I think Bill said it all.
Terrific. Okay, well, let me just reset. We're more than halfway through our conversation. Arizona Capital Times Morning Scoop, what makes a good election? Our guests are Sybil Francis, Chair, President, and CEO of the Center for the Future of Arizona, and Bill Gates, Mechanics of Democracy Laboratory Executive Director. And though we're very happy to hear from Ken Bennett, there is also room for others of you who are viewing right now if you have a question for us. And Sybil, before we get to that next slide, I do want to get to this question, because it was something that we sort of alluded to when it came to speed. This comes from Sandra. Have news organizations unintentionally trained voters to expect same-night election results? And does that expectation contribute to distrust when counting takes longer? Bill, I wonder if you want to just jump in on that one. As a longtime member of the media, I feel like I'm being thrown in. No, I'm teasing. But anyway, I do feel like there is the feeling that the expectations were, well, we're going off the air at midnight tonight. We better have results. And I think people that I worked with for years were not disappointed if there weren't, but they did want the general public to understand why they weren't ready.
Yeah, I think the election night coverage, which is fabulous. We're all excited, those of us who are interested in politics, we'd love, popping the popcorn and watching that. And it's a lot of fun. And, it's like when you're watching a movie or you're watching a show on Netflix and you have that cliffhanger, and you don't have everything wrapped up. We kind of groan, right? So we expect that not just from the media, we expect that from TV and movies. But the reality is sometimes, it isn't the end of that series on election night. It might have additional episodes, and we do need to educate people about it. But actually, I would point to our social media influencers and some of our candidates who have, as opposed to getting out and giving a message of, we need to trust our election workers. The process is going out. This is how elections are run in Arizona. There's nothing new. Unfortunately, we've had some candidates over the past few cycles who have said that this must be a sign of, some sort of incompetence by our elections officials. Perhaps there's some sort of fraud that's going on. So I look to our candidates as much as I look to the media to be more responsible on this and to come meet with the elections officials, find out what the timeline looks like, as opposed to, frankly, speaking about things that maybe they don't fully understand.
Sybil, I want to get to our final slide. Make sure you can see that one. That has to do with changing how Arizona's primary system works. That 72% of Arizona support some form of change, possibly including a shift to open primaries.
I'm not seeing the slide, but I can start speaking to that. This is something we've been monitoring for some time. At the center, we got kind of curious about how elections are designed, because one thing we are continually asked is, if this is what Arizonans want, why are we not seeing that in our political results? And so we've been asking ourselves that question, and it's certainly how elections are designed and what the incentive structure is for those elections is something of interest to us. So we've asked several times about how primaries work and what the preferences are of Arizonans and of Arizona voters. So this time we asked a set of 3 questions. We said, it's fair for political parties to determine who votes in their primaries. The second question was, there shouldn't be as many barriers I'm paraphrasing, by the way.
I can read you the
I'm
numbers.
hoping the slide comes up,
So,
but I'm paraphrasing. So, should there be fewer barriers, and should it be easier for people to vote in the different partisan primaries? So, as many of you probably know, if you're an independent, you have to really go through extra hoops to either vote in the Democratic or Republican primary, or you're kind of out in the cold. And then the third option was to create open primaries. And so 72% of people responded to our survey yes to the second and third options. And I think we do have the actual breakdown of how that worked out.
may I read it to you, Sybil? Because
Oh, yeah, please.
my fat fingers did not
Yeah.
give us the slide. I apologize. Which of the following statements comes closest to your view? 21% say it's reasonable for political parties to decide who votes in the primaries. If someone chooses not to register with a party, they shouldn't be able to vote in that party's primary. 27% said it's not fair that independent voters have to take extra steps to participate in party primaries. Since primaries are publicly funded, all registered voters should have the same access. And the other said 45%. Arizona should replace party primaries with an open primary system. In an open primary, all candidates, regardless of party, appear on the same ballot, and any registered voter can vote for any candidate.
Exactly. So this is very consistent with previous findings that we have found in previous surveys.
Bill, what are your thoughts, considering that there was an open primaries effort in 2024 that came up short?
Yeah. So this.
Yes, go ahead. So yeah, you go.
I'll just take a quick
yes,
stab
yes.
at it. And then, yeah. So I think I will say, for all our survey results, we are not naive to think that somehow what Arizonans want magically transforms into political outcomes. We know that there are so many factors that impact whether or not what the majority of Arizonans care and want appears as a political result. We see this over and over, which is one of the reasons we asked about how are elections designed and what is the incentive structure in there. And I think for those of you who followed this issue, we know that partisan primaries tend to bring out the more ideologically motivated voters, and that tends to have an impact on the type of candidates that come before voters. And so and then if elections and campaigns, there's money, there's information that may not be totally accurate about what the ballot initiative is about. There may be confusion. May not be enough voter education. So the fact that failed doesn't really change our perspective on this. And you see that 45% want to see open primaries or some kind of change. So, it's also possible that the ballot initiative wasn't quite exactly what voters might have wanted, but we do see a very strong sentiment for something different than what we have right now.
And Sybil, are those changes possible, even if the greater electorate may support the concept when both major parties remain opposed to this kind of thing?
Yeah, it's sort of interesting to me that the parties are opposed to this because it's not proposing elimination of parties. It's proposing that the candidates running for office have more of an incentive to be responsive to the majority of the electorate versus to their bases. And so I'm not exactly sure why they find this so threatening, but yes, it does make it a challenge and kind of an uphill challenge to make change if the major parties who have such megaphones are opposed to this.
Bill, do you have thoughts on that with the two major parties opposed?
Yeah, I think it's very challenging. My colleague at ASU, Alberto Olivas, has commented on, in particular, the 2024 initiative, and there were some specific issues involved that I think led to its defeat. But I think the findings here really make the point and underline the fact that essentially Maricopa County and the state of Arizona are divided up about a third, a third, a third, right? About a third of us are Republicans, a third of us are Democrats, and a third of us are independents. And it is a fact that it is harder for independents to participate in our political system. It'll be interesting to see this new party, or I guess the existing party, no labels, becoming the Arizona Independent Party, the impact they may have. They announced their one of the gubernatorial candidates yesterday. So that's going to be very interesting. If I can just add, there's from Mike has a question in the Q&A saying, wouldn't open primaries mean more money and earlier in the election cycle? Interesting point. The reality is that just as I was talking about sort of our culture of elections in Arizona, our culture has involved these primaries where we kind of go to our separate corners and then one third is sitting on the outside until we get to the general election. I think that would mean more people, but true, it's a fair point, more money earlier in the process as well.
And that's Sybil, I will, we did hear from Carol Lynn that want to talk about young voters, which I want to get to a slightly later. We have a little bit more time. So the next question I want to ask you, though, because this is one that Bill sort of alluded to about 20 minutes ago or so. 87% of those surveyed support increased funding for Arizona's elections to improve how they're run. And this was the headline, Sybil, for many of us. Connected to that is that 76% would support a small increase in state taxes to bring about those improvements. 76%. So quite interesting.
This is an absolutely stunning, unique result in all our survey research. I cannot overemphasize how many questions we've asked on so many issues, including asking people if they're willing to support small tax increases for things that matter to them. On other issues, we actually have found that, in Arizona, we often hear we just have to cut taxes. But in fact, there is not an insignificant sentiment among people who are willing to pay more in taxes for certain things they care about. But this is completely unheard of. We have never seen numbers this high. It's absolutely stunning result. That's all I can say.
Yeah.
And I
Bill,
think
your
it does
public
go
life, yeah,
back.
sorry. Yeah.
I think it does, sorry, it does go
Yes.
back to that initial question, which is, are fair and secure elections essential to democracy? And I think this is very much aligned with the things that people care about.
Right, Sybil, and that means that people may be willing to put their money where their mouths are, which is a kind of a stunning result
Right.
to some
Yeah.
extent. So, Bill, considering you spent time as a Republican elected official, are you surprised that this means many Republicans would be supportive of a slight tax increase?
Yes, I agree with Sybil. These are stunning results, particularly the strong majority of Republicans who would support a tax increase for elections. But then when you go back and you look at those very first numbers we are looking at that shows it's nearly unanimous that Arizonans believe that elections are important, then I guess we can understand these results better. But this is something that our elected officials need to know both at the county level as well as the state level. Arizonans are willing to invest in great elections. Vitally important result.
Bill, for those people who were not with us a while back in the conversation, can you give us maybe a Cliff's Notes version of what you think that extra funding could most effectively be used for if it came about?
So to the extent that we have people concerned about the speed of our results, That funding can be used to bring in more elections workers who can help and maybe even build new elections facilities, as we've seen in many counties. Maricopa County is now in the process of building a new facility. With those investments, we can get results quicker. With investments in elections administrators, we can also have an improved voter experience. Of all the people who work in counties, people in elections are some of the lowest paid. And I know I'm biased here, working in the field, but that's just wrong. I mean, we hear how important it is to Arizonans that we have great elections. Let's start paying people who are in elections the money that they deserve for a tough job that it is critical to our democracy.
So, Sybil, as I alluded to, I want to spend a little bit more time on younger voters and their responses. I don't have specific numbers in front of me, but let me phrase it for you. They're much more supportive of automatic voter registration and same-day voter registration. But going back to another topic we discussed, they don't think voting by mail is as convenient in the same way as older voters. What do you make of that initially? But from a bigger picture, why was it important to dig into some of the perspectives and the differences between some of these younger voters and older generations?
Yeah, but I just wanted to comment on something that's going on in the chat because I certainly didn't mean to imply, if it came across that way, that independents are barred from voting in the partisan primaries. They just have to take an extra step. And so, yes, they're allowed to vote in the partisan primaries. Having said that, that extra step, and it could be that or other reasons, but independents tend to vote at half the rate of the people who vote, the Republicans or registered Republicans or Democrats in primaries. So it's believed that that extra step is a barrier. And some people say, well, if these are paid for by the taxpayers, why should some group of politically affiliated people who are independents have a harder time voting? That was the
And,
point that we were trying to make, not that they are barred, but that they have to take that extra step, which can be a barrier.
and
So I
Sybil,
just
if I may say something briefly on that also, that the people who are registered independent for a reason, even if it means they can vote in the primary, maybe they don't want to register with one of the parties. Anyway, sorry, go ahead.
Right, exactly. So it does kind of beg the question of why is it that there's a certain group of people who have to take an extra step in order to vote? So I just wanted to make sure that we were not unclear on that and that this is what we're trying to address. As far as younger voters are concerned, all of our surveys, we ask a number of demographic questions so that we know a lot about who the respondents are so that we can speak with confidence and statistical validity. So what was very interesting about younger voters was that they did have some different perspectives on some really interesting things, including on what they considered convenient in terms of voting. As you mentioned, they don't see mail-in ballots as convenient. And no, as convenient as other voters do of
Right.
different ages. And apologies to any young people here, but I know you don't have to put a stamp on a mail-in ballot, but I just kind of joke like, how do you get a stamp? Where's the post office? Where's the post office box? We did not ask the question about voting by phone, but my guess is that that would be out the roof relative to young people in terms of their preferences. So they are the reason we think it's important and why we wanted to bring out some of these differences with young people is that they are our future. So as we think about voter participation, what's considered convenient, how much are we really reaching the electorate? It's important to think of these young people. We often complain that young people don't vote very much. Well, maybe we need to be thinking about what is convenient for them. How do they see the voting process? So just some really interesting results around young people.
Yeah, thanks for that, Sybil. And Bill, since you with Model at ASU, you're dealing with students, you're dealing with younger voters or those who are on the cusp of voting. Even anecdotally, what can you tell us about how they seem to feel about some of these things like mail-in ballots? Or does it ring true with what the numbers CFA came up with?
Yeah, no, it definitely does. And a couple things with young voters. First, again, we bemoan how little they participate in the political process, but that is a tale as old as time. And actually, relatively, youth participation is pretty high right now, has been in the last few elections. As I mentioned earlier, because of what has happened over the past few years and the media coverage of the administration of elections itself, we now have students who know that this is a job And with the creation of Model here at ASU, they're coming to our events. They want to get involved. We'll have an undergraduate fellowship that we'll be running this year where students, actually college students from across Arizona, will have the opportunity to work in election offices. We're partnering with the Arizona Secretary of State's office that began this program in 2024. And actually, Christine Moore in the Q&A references her involvement as a poll worker and how she learned so much from that. And so that's why I'm definitely encouraging our students to either get engaged as poll workers or potentially as observers for the political parties as well. And I wanted to kind of underline the comment that Sybil had made, clarifying the involvement of independents in our primaries. But there is that one little exception, which is the presidential primary that we have every 4 years. The independents are blocked, completely blocked from participating in those, even though those are funded with taxpayer dollars. But otherwise, it is a choice that independents have to make to pick one ballot or the other. And the surveys show, the evidence shows over and over again that they're not doing that.
So, Sybil, we just have a few minutes left. I want to get to convenings in a moment before we close up. Let Bill have a chance at that as well. But the big picture that I think every time we collaborate with Center for the Future of Arizona is what can be done with this information to get policymakers and elected officials to take action? What are your thoughts on that to remind folks who may not be as familiar with CFA?
Well, at CFA, as I tried to make clear in my opening remarks, we really are about listening to Arizonans, centering their voices, and finding where we have those areas of agreement. We're very much focused on where we agree. There's plenty of people who are concerned about how do we bring differing perspectives together to work out, some common ground. We have so much common ground in Arizona, so much more than anyone really realizes. And I think this survey on what Arizonans consider a good election is a great, great example of that, including on what you might call some hot button or politically salient issues. We see our role as centering the voices of Arizonans and sharing that information. We are not advocates per se, although I like to say we are advocates on behalf of the voices of Arizonans. So really what we do, our role as we practice it, is to share this information with candidates running for office, with elected leaders, with other leaders across the state, so that they can take that information and have data-informed discussions, decision-making, and action. Our fondest hope is that people will look at this information and use it to inform their decision-making. So that's really the role that we see for ourselves in all of this. And
Bill,
I'll just
knowing that, yeah,
one
sorry,
more.
yes.
We did a media preview before we released these results, and one of the reporters asked, how do we hold elected leaders accountable? Well, in my mind, the way you hold elected leaders accountable is you say, this is the information that we know that Arizonans care about. How is what you're doing, does it relate to what the majority of Arizonans say they want? Because all of our information is really about where we have those majorities of Arizonans across the political spectrum, as well as age group.
And Bill, knowing that elected officials certainly are not a monolith in any way, so I don't want to generalize too much. What would it take for more elected officials to look at these numbers closely and think to themselves, maybe there is some action worth taking here?
Well, I certainly hope that, we appreciate, Steve, the opportunity to talk about these results here and everyone who's listening today. But we really do feel like these convenings that we'll be holding across the state, the first one February 25th in Phoenix, the second one in Tucson on March 18th, and the third one in Flagstaff on April 17th. We're inviting community leaders, elections officials, state legislators, and others to dig into this rich data that CFA has been able to obtain through the survey. And we're excited to be partnering in these convenings, both with CFA and also with the Democracy Defense Project. So it's very important focus of ours at Model that we are, and this is our term we use, Steve, partisan inclusive. So we're not nonpartisan, but we're partisan inclusive. So we have Republicans, we have Democrats, we have independents, both actual Arizona Independent Party as well as party not determined in the room, and we're excited about that discussion. And maybe if I could just take 1 second, we do have a few questions from Jennifer Lewer, who is head of communications at Maricopa County Elections, and she raises a question about how do we address all that misinformation that's out there. Well, I want to take a second to give a big shout out to Jennifer and the communications team at Maricopa County Elections, who has done yeoman's work for years to push back on this. It's hard work, but it's important that, and certainly Arizonans are willing to invest in this, that we get the truth out there about how elections are run. And to the extent that there are challenges, we need to address those. We need to work together. But also the falsehoods that are out there, that's something else that we'll be addressing through those convenings and having a discussion to make sure that the facts are out there.
And Sybil, I want to give you the last word, sort of a takeaway. I know we've been had an hour of discussion, but if you could give someone a 60-second takeaway before we close, what would you say?
Well, first of all, I'm so thrilled to be working with Bill. So thank you, Bill, and thanks, Steve, for running such a great morning scoop conversation. I think the takeaway really is look at the data, look at what Arizonans care about, and let's find a way to make sure that we're able to act on those priorities, and that to listen to the kind of more partisan, politicized conversation is maybe one part of reality, but I think another really important reality is what is it that actually Arizonans care about, and what do they consider to be a good election?
Thank you, Sybil. That is all for this Arizona Capital Times Morning Scoop, What Makes a Good Election. We've heard from Sybil Francis, Chair, President, and CEO of the Center for the Future of Arizona, and Bill Gates, Mechanics of Democracy Laboratory Executive Director at Arizona State University. Thanks so much for watching this morning. I'm Steve Goldstein.
Thank you.